Hello, everyone, and welcome to Water and Communications 2023. Very nice to have you back in for the workshops. And as you know, Water and Communications is a special program that has been developed together with the Grundfos Foundation. And the focus is on this World Water Week theme of 2023, Seeds of Change, Innovative Solutions for a Water-Wise World. My name is Jörg Espelund, and I am the host of this program. Our producer is Cecile Pilon-Hugh. I think it's time for me now to introduce our speaker. We have Brandi Shaw-Morris, Assistant Professor, Aarhus University and Partner Engagement Lab. Welcome, Brandi.
Thank you.
You are going to talk about biological realities no communicator can escape, or not even CEOs, engineers, and scientists. We're also going to talk about framing climate messages and how to harness power of story. So over to you, Brandi, and welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I guess it's towards the end of the program, so I hope that you have a little bit of energy to hang in there with me just a wee bit longer. As Jorel said, I am, I have kind of a unique background, at least in academia, because I am a scientist currently working as a researcher at Aarhus University in Denmark, but the bulk of my experience is actually in the private sector as a communication strategist, specifically working in an agency environment where we used empirical testing of our messages for large NGOs. So we had a really good read across hundreds of thousands and oftentimes even millions of data points where we would test every aspect of a message to understand what worked and what didn't work. And then one of the reasons I was intrigued to look into, to do a PhD actually was because I was, after many years of doing this, very curious to understand why some things worked better than others. So of course, on a daily basis as a journalist or working in marketing and advertising or whatever, as a practitioner, you don't get that opportunity to go deep. So that was what drove me. And specifically, I was very interested in looking into climate change. So we'll get back to that in just a second. I'll just dive into it. So these are some of the companies I worked with or have owned myself. Engagement Lab, this company down here, is my current company where I'm a partner and owner. I don't work in that company daily. There are some other people that do that, but they're evidence-based stakeholder advisory firm. But these are some of my clients. And as mentioned, my daily work is in behavioral science at Aarhus University. And I won't belabor this fact because I'm sure that everyone here who's participating is very familiar with the unique dynamics of climate change. But I'm familiar, I know that you guys are focused on water, and I actually did, after I finished my PhD, work for a company called Grundfos, which was, I think, was one of your sponsors, as a communication consultant focusing on sustainability. So I'm very familiar with water problems and the water market and some of the challenges that communicators face as they try to bring various stakeholders on board with the urgency of the water agenda, water scarcity, and so on and so forth, water circularity and all these issues. But today, I'm going to take mostly climate change as my case because the points or the underlying mechanisms are similar or even identical. And so I hope that we can kind of at the end bring this together to kind of talk a little bit about how, maybe in the Q&A even, how these things apply to water. But kind of to jump off into that, the first thing is, we know that humans are very adept at reacting to threats in our environment. But as it turns out, climate change doesn't have some of those specific mechanisms that trigger our cerebral alarms in the face of danger. So, there are certain kinds of things with threats that make us ready and willing and able to take action immediately in the face of danger. So I was curious about this, and I was also particularly, I'm not sure why it's not advancing, particularly worried and dismayed by the fact that we know that we have so much data, and the data has been, we could discuss kind of when it was unequivocally accepted or when it went mainstream, but we know that around 1987, when a guy named Jim Hansen spoke from NASA, spoke to the American Congress, there was bipartisan support. And there was no partisanship around the issue. He just basically conveyed that there was no doubt that humans were changing, human activity was changing the climate through the release of CO2 into the atmosphere. What's scary about this is that since that time, literally since around 1987, since we've had all of this kind of unequivocal data, and again, I know that we've been talking about climate change much longer than that, but since that time, over half of the CO2 that's ever been released due to human activity was released since that time. So the bottom line is that data is not enough. And we say we know this. I think we can all agree that data is not enough. But why isn't it enough? Because when we look at a lot of these numbers, when climate scientists are coming at us in the media daily and telling us it's almost too late, it's too late, it's probably too late, why is it that we're not reacting more? And what can we take away from this as communication practitioners, both in relation to climate change, but also specifically in relation to water? So the way I look at it is this is a little bit of a metaphor that a lot of times as communicators, we think that our message is this. It's this amazing, fancy, beautiful, statusy, glossy car or whatever it is. It's a campaign, it's a story, it's a white paper, whatever it is. And we're just so in love with it. We think we've put a lot of time, effort, and so on and so forth into it. The people in the room, we all like it. It speaks to us. But yet in reality, from what I've come to discover, a biological perspective, our message is something more like this. And so there are certain biological realities that no one can escape, because no matter how compelling or peer-reviewed your data is, no matter whether you have Arnold Schwarzenegger to be an endorser on your campaign, or it's been designed that you have like a beautiful, gorgeous advertisement that's been designed by like an agency in London, you're still subject to the same biological realities that all humans are subject to. So let's dive into those. But before we do, just a quick, this quote is famously attributed to Stalin. We don't know exactly, it might have come from another writer, but what he said was, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic. And this quote succinctly encapsulates a core dilemma that we have as communicators when we try to convince people using data or information. And it's not that the data or the information isn't important, it's that we're actually not neurologically wired to decode statistical data. We're not very good at it. And we're going to come back to that in a second. So, biological reality number one is that this is closely tied to what is the brain's main purpose. And if we were having a dialogue right now, I'd like to ask you, but people usually have a lot of thoughts. Like they'll say something like, it's to think, or it's to keep us out of danger. And all of these things are kind of part of the truth. But the reality is that the brain uses three forms of data to basically keep our bodies upright, alive, and well. So our brain's main purpose is to keep the systems of our body functioning, our internal systems, and to monitor the environment for danger and to make sure that we can stay safe and to thrive in that environment. So our biological reality, the reason this is so important is when people think that the brain's main purpose is thinking, that's actually not true. And not only is it far from accurate, it's very detrimental in terms of understanding how we communicate. So three sources of data that the brain uses to keep our bodies upright and alive and well and manage our internal systems. One is past experience. It's constantly running predictive models based on past experience. Another is exteroception. Many of us know this as sensory data. So sight, smell, touch, hearing, all of these things. So the data that's coming into our brains right now through our eyes, through our hearing, is helping the brain run predictions about our environment and about basically first and foremost, and I'm sorry, I should have said this, but when we go back to this, the brain's main purpose is something called allostasis. It's the optimal allocation of our bodily resources, our scarce bodily resources. So it's kind of like a budget or a bank account. We only have so much. And so the brain is making sure that those resources are optimally allocated for the things I mentioned, making sure that our bodies are upright, alive, well, thriving, and moving through the world safely. So using past experience, exteroception, and then here's the one that very few people know about. Even a lot of people working in the field of psychology haven't heard of something called interoception. And you might be thinking, well, I'm a journalist. What do I need to learn about this for? Well, I'll tell you, it has very profound implications for your work, because When I discovered this, because I work in interdisciplinary work, my own background is in marketing, as I said, and consumer psychology. But as I've, through my PhD, kind of been diving down into the mechanisms, which we're going to discuss about more effective forms of communication, what I came to realize is that biology is kind of everything when it comes to understanding these things. So you have psychology, you have neuroscience. Those are the two main fields I work in, and understanding how these relate to communication. So interoception, this is going to blow your mind if you've never heard of it before. It still blows my mind, is the faint bodily sensations that we have inside of our body. And it sounds weird, but you know that when we say something like, I felt it in my stomach, or I had butterflies in my stomach, or I had this sort of intuition, or things like this, our organs, believe it or not, are actually carrying data that our brain then uses to make a prediction about our environment and how we should move ahead in that environment. So our brain's running these predictions, and our internal organs are feeding data. A lot of people think that the brain is the one sending data to the body, and that's true, but it's a two-way process. So the internal bodily organs are also sending data to the brain that the brain then uses to make these predictions. Why is that important? It's important because these internal bodily sensations are actually the earliest form of what we call emotion, or what scientists we call affect. So affect is the precursor of emotion. So sometimes, so this is like a steady stream of data from the body to the brain, or, from the organs to the brain, internal bodily organs, and the brain is actually using that data. And sometimes it constructs an instance of emotion. So this is a little spoiler alert. If you have to pop out of the talk now, I'll just give you this, that if you had to take away one thing from my talk, and I spend a lot of time when I'm preparing for talks thinking about the audience and trying to think about what I can give that you can actually use, because I don't want to waste your time. And here's the thing that I think you can really take away, and that is that people don't care about climate change. You know that, but they really don't care about climate change. And people also don't care about water, actually. People don't care about water. What they do care about is what water can do for them. What they do care about is climate change, not as a problem, but how the many problems that make up climate change impede their safety, ability to keep their bodies upright, alive, thrive, and so on and so forth. So the brain doesn't care about climate change. The brain doesn't care about water. The brain cares about the optimal allocation of its scarce bodily resources. Okay, so this is super important. So we have to be really ruthless when it comes to our own thinking around messaging, when it comes to why would the brain care about this? And there's no magic bullet. So biological reality number two is that emotion is data. I already kind of told you that, but it's a steady stream of data that the brain uses. Now, why does the brain do this? Because, as I mentioned, our bodily resources are scarce. The brain is trying to figure out what it should pay attention to, what's most important. And in neuroscience, there's something we call the affective niche. So it's like this little niche of information. What is going to be put over into that niche that is worthwhile to really pay attention to? And one of the things we know is that people pay attention to things that trigger emotion, that trigger affect. So it's simply when we want to keep thinking, we have this sort of like idea, or this sort of fancy that we're so evolutionarily advanced that we should just get people to understand the data and become more statistically literate. And if we can help design these beautiful infographics. And what I'm not saying is that information and data don't matter. They matter a lot. They give a lot of credibility. But what I am saying is that this is not enough, because information without emotion is not important to the brain. So information that has affective, emotional meaning will be prioritized by the brain, because that's what the brain's designed to do. And if we had to cognitively elaborate on every little thing, then we wouldn't be able to live our lives effectively. And that's a whole other discussion, because we can talk about, basically, there is a cost, a cognitive and bodily cost to processing things cognitively, to kind of elaborating on these things. Now, one thing I want you to take away from this that's really important from like a modern neuroscience perspective is that when we think about cognitive elaboration and emotion, in reality, the brain, these aren't two separate things. They're entangled and you can never pull them apart. But for the sake of sort of simplicity, when we think about how we encode our information, or our messages, I want us to understand the difference here. So biological reality number 3 is that our biological and our social lives are actually intertwined. So I'm going to show you a video. Well, sorry, before I start the video, I want to say something about that. And that is something that we could have an entire conversation. We could talk for hours about just this one thing, about how important it is that our message and that we're cognizant of who our target audience is, and that we develop messages that align and are congruent with the core values, concerns, challenge, interests, and dreams and hopes of our target audience, which I'm going to tie together in a second. But I want to show you this video, and it's about a minute long, and I'd like you to watch and just think about what you see. Okay, so very interesting. One of the things that if I was to ask you right now what you saw, this is based on a very famous experiment, a very old experiment. What people tend to see, so obviously you have these two triangles and a circle and a box, but what people, when we ask, so what was happening, or what was that video about, people tend to immediately make up stories. That's kind of the bottom line. People say, well, I think it was a husband and a wife having a quarrel. One of them had a lover. They took off and left the house, but the other was trying to keep them there. And people have lots of different stories that they transpose onto this very simple illustration of geometric figures moving about on a screen. That biological reality number 4 is that we're actually wired for story. We're wired to decode the world in story. And as it turns out, even when we're not given a story with something as simple as some geometric features, we automatically transfer a story about what's happening. We make meaning of the world through story structure. And I like to bring out this guy because he is probably one of the top. He's definitely, if not then he's one of the top 3 affective neuroscientists in the world. His name is Antonio Damasio. You might have heard of a book he wrote called Descartes' Error. But basically, he's shown that when you impede areas of the brain associated with emotion, people actually make less rational decisions, not more rational decisions. So emotion is a key part of rationality. So when we think that if we just get people to set emotion aside, then we'll be more rational. No, emotion is actually a critical part of rationality. And what does Antonio say? And I like to bring this out because sometimes I'm talking to hard scientists or people in the natural science who don't have a lot of respect for arts and humanities, who've kind of always known that stories are the way to communicate. And what does he say? He says the problem of how to make all of this wisdom understandable, transmissible, persuasive, enforceable in a word of how to make it stick. It was faced and a solution found. Storytelling is the solution. Storytelling is something brains do naturally and implicitly. It should be no surprise that it pervades the entire fabric of human societies and cultures. So we know this, right? We know that a simple photo of this person right here, which only I'm finding that the younger generations are starting to not know who she is. A simple story of one girl who wrote a diary is a more compelling message about the Holocaust and World War II and the atrocities that happened towards Jews in World War II than all of the infographics in the world. right? This one picture, this one story of Anne Frank. We have hundreds of scientific studies that show it, that it facilitates all levels of Bloom's taxonomy, which if you're not familiar with that, that's something that in education we use to evaluate effective education. We think that it happens, among other things, by providing context and relevance, as well as information, which leads me to my really important point about story is think about story as the structure, kind of the framework of the house, not the content hung on that structure. And stories have certain features. They have an identifiable character. They have a plot with a temporal dimension moving through time. They have a goal or a hurdle or a challenge is a very important feature of a story, and they have a setting. This is the definition I use by Kendall Haven, which is the story is a detailed character-based narration of a character's struggles to overcome obstacles. That's super important. And to reach an important goal. And we could talk about this for days in relation to water challenges and climate. If you want to talk to me more about that, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can send me a message there. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into that. I'm already 1 minute over time, I can see, but Jorel told me I could take a couple more minutes. So how do stories work their magic? There are several ways, but I can tell you from various meta-analyses from scientific research that one of the main things that's happening is through identification with characters with whom we perceive that we share core values. So we know from neuroscience that when people identify or feel empathy for another person, we release a hormone, a neuropeptide called oxytocin. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's more complicated than just empathy and pro-social bonding, although that is one of the big functions. That is, we know that this is how humans connect with other humans. We release this peptide and it makes us want to help someone else. So through stories, we identify with other characters with whom we want to help. And there's a lot of really interesting research. If you want to read more about this, I recommend a couple papers that I've written that you might want to look into, and you can look at the sources and follow up on those more. This is from a paper that I'll get to in a second, but I just want to what I want to show you about this is that our prediction was that basically people are transported through the narrative and that predicts their pro-environmental behavior. But what we actually found as we were running our pilots is, and this is kind of where we're getting back to emotion, is that the structure of the narrative, whether it was a story or a fact-based narrative, actually predicted whether people became, whether or not it heightened people's autonomic arousal. That relates to interoception, which I told you earlier, because your bodily organs are innervated. They have nerves from your autonomic nervous system. So this is how emotion is detected, and that predicted pro-environmental behavior. I don't have time to go into the details, but here's a paper that I recommend you look at if you're interested in more about this, learning more about this. But we tested hundreds of real world climate change communications or campaigns from everything from the Royal Society and World Bank to NASA to HBO, real world campaigns or stories or fact-based campaigns. And what we found was that people who were in the story condition, so they received one of the story-based climate change communication campaigns, they were twice as likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. And we measured this using a bunch of different behaviors. They donated almost 30% more to a climate change charity, which is interesting if you think about they're actually willing to put their money into it when they're receiving money for the experiment. And interestingly, and I think most profoundly, the effect actually lasted 6 weeks post-study when we sent out a follow-up study, and we did not offer anyone additional remuneration for their participation. So this was a lasting effect, at least 6 weeks post-study. We did find that the valence, I don't have time to get into this, but that's the emotional tone of the message mattered, and that actually ending on a negative note was actually more effective than a positive note. But here's the scariest part of all. The scariest part of all was that participants in our control group, so in other words, those who received no information about climate change whatsoever, they actually performed more pro-environmental behavior than the people in our information treatment group. So in other words, yeah, right, I see Jorel's face, like this is really, I think, still very shocking, right? But if we think about what I told you in terms of biological reality number one, that the brain is constantly deciding which information to prioritize. And we are bombarded by information every day, right? From colleagues and friends and family and the news and on our social media. So how should the brain prioritize what to pay attention to? Emotion is a critical factor. And so information is not enough. But furthermore, there could be a mechanism by which we are actually attending even less to this information that's absent emotional connection. So it goes kind of into the trash bin, so to speak, because we receive so much of it. So I will conclude here. I just want to leave you with a couple more quick things. This is a paper that I'm currently working on about source credibility. I want to point out that a lot of times in the media, I think, or not just in the media, but particularly in science, actually, science communication, we tend to harp a lot on the perceived competence. So this person's a PhD, or they have 10 PhDs, or this person's an expert, or they're a CEO or whatever. But this is not just, I just want to point out here, this is just a drawing I made. This is not accurate in terms of the ratios. This dark blue sliver could be 0.001%. The one thing we do know from research is that whether or not people perceive the messenger to be trustworthy is way more important than whether or not they perceive them to be competent. Now, there's some links between those things, but I just want to point that out. So your messenger is super important, and knowing whether or not someone is credible obviously varies by the audience. So this is why it's so important to know and understand the things that your specific audience perceive as risks, challenges in the story characters, so on and so forth, so that you can craft a message that actually resonates with them. These are just some studies we did where we manipulated, this is a real world climate skeptic from something called the Cato Institute in the US. He became a believer in climate change, and we used his story to kind of change whether he was religious or not religious, whether he had some different values and worldviews. And we also tested this with a real world climate scientist, as well as a group of conservative politicians in Europe. And what we found was really scary, actually, is that not only did not surprisingly, people counter-argued less with their own in-group. They identified more with their own in-group, but that the messengers who affirmed the values of the most skeptical groups were most effective. But what I think is most interesting, if I go back here, is that people actually trusted the politicians more than the climate scientist, which is really thought-provoking and something that we're diving into more deeply now. I'm wrapping up here. Last note is that we're working, we have a project called RORCUS, so it's research on risk communication and stories. And I just want to put something out there for everyone to think about. One of the things we're looking at is changing out a lot of these buzzwords like climate change and sustainability, which kind of mean everything and nothing, and they've become very contaminated by social meaning, political meaning, identity. And then looking at trading that out with something that is more like the good life. Like, what is the good life about? And this ties into what I was talking about earlier with emotion, because when it comes to water, for example, water is not just about, as you know, it can be many things. So it's not just about survival, although it is that. It's about dignity. It's about having the resources that you want to keep your family safe. It's about entertainment. It's about so many things. So if we were laddering up from, the basic idea of giving people information about water, we would be thinking about these biological realities, that the brain's main function is to monitor the environment and to make sure that the body is allocating its resources effectively, that emotion is data, that there are deep ties between our social and biological lives, and that we're wired to decode the world in story. And I hope that maybe you might consider thinking about taking your messages about water and thinking about how this actually ties into what is a good life. Because what we found by interviewing lots of people now is that no one mentions climate change. No one mentions water. No one mentions all of these issues which are critical to their survival and health. They mention other things related to what makes their life good. And so we as communicators need to find ways to tie into things that people not only care about and say they care about, but that actually matter biologically to their brains in terms of their survival, so that we'll make it into their affective niche. So I know that was a lot, but thank you for your time, and feel free to connect with me if you have any questions that we can't get to here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandi, very, very much. That was very interesting and quite thought-provoking as well. And a lot of new insights, I think, at least for me. And we have some comments here. Magdalena says, so even when the audience requests analytical approaches to information, biology tells us that we need to tell a relevant story to appeal to the brain. Very insightful, yeah. And we have another comment here. There was a research at a US university in the context of violent reactions, which traced it back as a visceral response to childhood witnesses of violence. Your presentation reminds me of that. You want to comment on that, perhaps?
I'm not sure I can say, can the person maybe add a little bit more?
Afia, do you want to add something more to that comment? There was also another comment here from Afia. So on point, identification of audience is important for communicators. Some people need to know about the impact, but not necessarily in the context of climate change. So maybe we should frame our message a little bit differently and speak about the impact more than speak about the temperature rise or sea levels rising or iceberg melting. What do you think?
I think that it's very much, I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with a climate change. She's a climate scientist, and she's also she's the chief scientist at Nature Conservancy. Her name is Catherine Hayhoe. She wrote a book called Saving Us. She's someone that I collaborate with. And as she wrote in her book, I think this ties it together, is that, you know, people don't care about rising temperatures. That's another thing. People don't care about that. They care about what it does for them, how it affects them. So if they like to go to Greece, then they suddenly care that they can't go to Greece anymore because there's wildfires, right? If they like to snow ski, they care about the fact that snow is basically disappearing. Long-term snowpack is changing. If they care about fishing, and I know I'm coming with a lot of outdoor examples here, but I'm just saying that people care about things that matter to their well-being and to their thriving. So yeah, I think that's my thought. Yes.
Cecilia has posted the link to Saving Us. Anyone interested? It's in the chat.
And I also posted the link, URL to the video, or it's not a link, but you can just go on YouTube and look for the Hyder and Simmel animation.
Yeah. And there were also some requests, and if you could please post some of the links to your papers, Brandi, so that people can look it up.
I can do that.
You'll do that after this, and we can have a look at it. Tita says, it's interesting to notice that the message that ended on a sad note had more effect than those that ended on a positive note. How do we marry this with the need for solution journalism or telling positive stories? Do we think that this research might impact how we should tell those stories?
I think this is a complicated finding because we know, well, what's interesting is to preempt one of the things that we knew we were going to get pushback from reviewers on, where we thought people are going to say, well, because there's a lot of, it's a very hot topic, right? That if you paralyze people, you give them lots of negative, pessimistic messaging, they're going to just like check out and say, I'm not doing anything. And my guess would be that there definitely is a point which comes when that happens. But what's interesting was, for fun, we included what we called the apocalyptic condition in our research, where we not only gave a positive and a negative, but then we took one, we created, this is a real world climate change campaign, by the way, where we actually re-edited the end. And we said, we had them say, it's too late. It's already too late to do anything about it. And what's interesting is there's this human need, this like optimism bias, which a lot of you may have heard of, where even in that extreme condition, even the groups that say they're most pessimistic, or no, they're not the most pessimistic, they're most angry and irritated by what they call the doomsayers in the climate message. So conservative audiences, particularly, even they were not only more we're not only more worried about climate change. That's one thing, to be worried and to perceive the risk. That's one of the things we measure, risk perception, because you can't really have any people doing something about a problem until they actually perceive the risk. But here's the more thought-provoking. The other measure we used was what's called outcome efficacy. And outcome efficacy is a measure of whether or not you actually think your own actions matter. So it's really important to tell, you can tell people, oh, you do this, you do that. And they say, yeah, well, okay, I'm just one person, I'm just one household. But actually, even in the most apocalyptic condition, people had an even stronger sense that what they did mattered. to climate change. So how I square that with the negative emotion is that what I understand and know from neuroscience is that our brains are prioritizing. I've mentioned that many times, but positive affect, positive emotion is a signal to the brain that everything's fine in our environment. So what does that tell? Should I use my scarce bodily resources when everything's fine in the environment? No, I should not. It doesn't merit ranking high on my brain's list of priorities when it's a positive message. Does that make sense? So negative affect, we know what research, there's a pretty robust finding that people tend to attend to more negative messages. There's a bias towards negative messaging, but there's probably a biological reason for that. And that is that information is more important to our survival than positive information, because when we think everything's fine, there's no need to do anything.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, it's a very difficult balance as well. Between, like, as we've been talking about before, solution-driven journalism and such, and the fact that we react more negative news or information. Afia has now mentioned a little bit more about that US study. I meant that the emotional response is embedded in the brain, tracing back to experiences. So if water shortage due to climate change is the issue, water scarcity and the difficulties it causes would resonate more than figures.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes, I would agree with that. And something you said, Urel, 1 second ago about the balance, I think this is not to say, just like you can embed information into a story structure. We're not saying take away the information, take away the data. You have the data, you just acknowledge the biological reality that the brain decodes the world in story. Like same way, just because you tell people about the dire consequences and bring that negative valence doesn't mean that you can't also give people therefore what they can do about it to fix it. So I don't think the one precludes the other. It's not that we can't be solution oriented and give people effective actions to take to mitigate the danger.
So maybe it's a better way is actually to combine the two and we get action.
Yes, and I think I didn't include this because I saw the audience was such a mixed bag of types of people. But I was trying to strike a balance when I know there are some scientists, but I know there are a lot of journalists, is advice that I usually give to practitioners is to definitely employ a scientific approach to developing your messaging. So I know that journalists don't do this as much because they're kind of just about conveying the message, but to test things, to, test hypotheses, to actually look at what works with your target audience, this is just good practice. It's not being manipulative or anything like that. This is what big NGOs do to also figure out how can we engage the most people within different segments.
Thank you. We have one more comment here. Webby says, how can a hydrologist communicate to politicians about hydrological extremes such as floods and get them to implement information provided for in early warning forecast to avert the level of imminent disaster occurrence? So it could probably be any problem, but how do we actually get through to the politicians with our message, no matter?
My short answer to that would be figure out what matters to the politicians and focus on that. So whatever that is, I would figure out how to tie that into your message, because in the end, their brains are also looking at like, what's in it for me? And that sounds very cynical, but I don't mean it like that. There are good people in the world, but in the end, the brain, that politician is trying to figure that out. So hydrologists, I would guess, like every other group, tend to communicate to politicians as if they were speaking to themselves, because that's often what groups do, is you talk as if you're talking to someone that is like you. Don't do that. Figure out what matters to them and focus your messaging on that.
Thank you. We are running a little bit out of time, but doesn't matter because I'm going to facilitate the next session and I'm already here. So anyway, Magdalena, can positive messaging cancel out the effect of negative messaging? As in, if we start on a doomsday scenario but end in positive call to action, will that diminish the effect of the story? Any research on that or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And definitely, so this is one of the things that we need to look at a lot more, right? Because if you think of a video or a story as it's like it has a temporal dimension of time-based, right? I would definitely predict that you're going to get different results depending on whether you start negatively and then go negatively, then positively, then and negatively, and vice versa. If you start positively, then and negatively, then, you know, these different combinations will have different outputs. What we did was we focused on how the message ended, because this is the thing that people take away, and it's usually closely tied to the call to action. So again, what was really interesting was in one of the conditions, for example, we had the person who was talking, she's actually a multi-generational beekeeper. So she was actually a young woman in her late 20s, very eloquent and telling, and it was beautifully filmed, showing how the effect of basically that pollinators are dying and the effect that this will have on the food supply. And so the original version that they developed at University of North Carolina in a series they call Climate Stories, which, by the way, are some of the few really good climate stories that I've seen done. So you have these big budgets at NASA and Royal Society and World Bank, and then this little tiny university is doing something that I think was really good. The original version said, well, the younger generations, we care about climate change. We're doing something about it. We're working on this. And then we re-edited the end to kind of leave it at a different place where she talked earlier about the detrimental effects. And it was only a few seconds. It was like 5 seconds we edited. And then the apocalyptic condition. And what we found is that people just weren't as emotionally aroused, and that this predicted then their sense of risk perception and outcome efficacy. So you can read more about that in the paper, but I would definitely predict that these different combinations that you're mentioning, Magdalena, would affect different results. How exactly they would do that, we haven't studied yet, but it's one of those things that's on the agenda.
Good. We're looking forward to that, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that study. Marissa says, love this talk, one of the best I've heard in a long time. Congrats, and thank you very much. And thank you very much, Brandi. It was a very interesting talk, and you have posted your details. People can reach out to you on LinkedIn. So if you want to keep up the discussions, or if you have any more questions, you can reach out.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I will mute myself now, but I will post the papers in the chat. So if you'd like to go in and download them or whatever, then you can read more about that.
Thank you. Thank you so
everyone.
Much.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Right. We are now going to move into a more interactive session like we did yesterday. And we've heard Brandi speak about the audience, how important it is to capture the audience, to capture the right audience, and to know the target audience hopes and dreams and how they perceive the message. And yesterday, those of you who were with us yesterday, we did the top line test that Will de Freitas was talking about at the conversation. And if you missed that workshop, it basically is to summarize your story in a 1-sentence summary. We're now going to take those sentences and work a little bit more with them, because I'm going to give you the sentences shortly. I've pulled 6 sentences, I think, from yesterday, and we're going to allocate you into breakout rooms where you will discuss these water stories. And we asked you to present a story, why it matters, potential backers, and you were going to put that in a sentence. This time, you're going to pick one of those sentences and you're going to decide on your audience. And I want you to discuss from this sentence, like, what is this story about? Why is it important? But specifically, who is the audience? And then you're going to say, right, so we got the audience. How are we going to reach them? And what actions do we want them to take? Cecile has posted this one in the chat as well, because unfortunately when we go into breakout rooms, the chat room closes, you won't see it. So download the PowerPoint that Cecile has posted, and these are the sentences that I have picked out. In your group of 4, choose one sentence and work with it. what is the story is about, who is the audience, and how are we going to reach them? And then what actions do we want them to take? After that, we are going to come back into the main room, and I will ask a few of you to unmute yourself and basically talk about the results and what conclusions you've drawn. I hope that you found that exercise useful and interesting and maybe difficult. But you know, that's what it's all about, to learn more. And I'm now going to call from room 1. I'm not sure, do you know which room you were in, or shall I tell you who was in that room 1? You can indicate in the chat if you know. You know which, because in room 1 was Bulawayo Tito, Gabriella, Miriam, and Sandra. That's room 1, and I would ask one of you to unmute yourself and present your findings, your results, your conclusions. So do you want to have a volunteer, or shall I just say, welcome, Bulawayo Tito? I can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit louder, please.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so we did not get the opportunity to conclude, but we picked the third sentence: not demanding good quality information about water management leads you to water vulnerability. And we decided that the story is about access to good quality water and water in general. We also decided that it's important to reach out with this story because based on the session we just finished and other sessions, people need to understand how water quality affects them. If they do not understand, they would not be able to, they would not care or demand that something be done about it. And it's also important because we need to use this to advocate to policymakers and politicians. We also, the next question, who the audience is. Politicians and also people in the community. We also thought about water utilities or professionals in the water sector. So we did not get to defining how to reach them or what platforms to use. So yeah, thank you.
Right, thank you. So next time we'll give you a few more minutes so that you can have longer time to discuss. Just one question: is there anyone from room 1 who wants to add something about how, and you too, Bulawayo Tito, how was the exercise? Was it difficult? Was it easy?
Yeah, if I may say something.
Yeah, who are we talking to?
Gabriela.
Hey, Gabriela, hi.
Hi, thank you. Yes, the questions were very interesting. At the beginning, we had 2 proposals for questions. So for the sentence, sorry, the sentence, and I think it took a little bit time to decide on which of the sentence. We didn't have some of them didn't have couldn't see the sentences, and that's why as well. And but then once we got one, then yeah, I think everyone needed a little bit time to think about that sentence, and then it starts rolling.
All right, thank you. Very good feedback. Thank you. Should we move to room 2? In room 2, I have Afia, Nancy, Raisha, and Leonore. Anyone volunteering to present?
Yes, I am presenting. Nancy here from.
Hi Nancy, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having us. We went with the sentence of recharge of groundwater using runoff water as an approach for flood control in cities. So we decided that our audience would most likely be local government, and that the solution would be a solution-based story. And why we decided that this was important is that it's important to reach out to local government, as they are the ultimate solution providers. They are accountable to the people and the communities, as well as their safety, and ensuring local economy, prosperity, and things like that. And what's next? Yes, and the what of the story is about providing mitigation to a changing climate and extreme weather events, especially in urban landscapes where you get a lot of urban creep, and therefore the natural kind of drainage systems get taken away. And I mean, we've all heard this before, like a lack of absorption of the excess water, etc. But the angle that we thought would get their attention the most is going at it from a cost-benefit analysis approach, because ultimately local governments work with budgets, and if you can kind of explain to them, if you create resilience now, you will save money in the future because you won't have to put money into rectifying flood damage and etc. in the future, and it creates that resilience that is needed. And in terms of how to get to these local government people and to get their attention, we thought about government forums. They have those government public forums, as well as events and conferences. But actually we thought a bit deeper and thought it would be good to go to government advisors, because they are often the gatekeepers between what the politicians eventually end up seeing. And additionally, because local government and politicians have so much going on all the time, you have to really hit them with the headlines. They won't want to read a 10-page article about the cost benefit analysis and all the numbers and things like this. So you have to give it to them in very simple terms, and then you can start to add the actual the bulk of it after that. So that's what we came up with, more or less.
That was a lot. Thank you very much. Very well done, and very structured. And I think that you also brought in Brandi's message there, that you speak to the people and appeal to what matters to them when you were talking about the cost benefit and taking that approach. Any difficulties in completing the exercise or anything like that?
I think we struggled finding context. So so that one sentence is kind of very broad, and trying to, I mean, this could be anywhere in the world, right? So I guess maybe if we had more time, we could have picked an example that we were familiar with and worked around that. But other than that, I think it was okay, more or less.
Right, thank you. I mean, one reason why I picked the sentences that you created or you wrote yesterday is also to show a little bit, I mean, how little or how much you can get into one sentence, and how important that sentence can be and conclude if you really want to summarize everything in basically one line, and how difficult it is. So I'm really that's why we're working with yesterday's sentences. Thank you very much, everyone in room 2. We are now going to be a little bit more random and pick room 5, and we have Anna, Dr. Shiba, and Duja, and Nora. And did you decide anyone who wanted to tell us about your conclusions or what you've been talking about, or shall I pick a person? Do you have a volunteer from room 5?
I can volunteer if everyone from the group is okay with it.
Yes, sure. Who are we talking to?
Induja.
Induja, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So we picked the topic about the women's role as the water managers. So we.
The line is a little bit crackly. Can you take that again, please?
Oh, yeah. So we picked the topic of women as key water managers, the success story. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So we took this topic, and the context that we discussed was in so where we work in remote areas providing water access. And so this story was about how the project in its overall thing, it doesn't have target audience as women, but then it just serves rural population, in providing the water, bringing the water access. And then we were talking about how this fact that this whole problem, this whole solution is benefiting a lot of women, about 90% of women, so to say. How this project is, even though it's not mentioned like project for women or women empowerment, this is actually directly benefiting a lot of women. So we were discussing about this, and I gave my group a context about what is happening and social in India in respect to gender issues, especially in such remote locations and all. And why this is important to tell this story out is because often this story in our own context that has inspired a lot of these small sharings from one geographical location to another, actually inspired a lot of women who were not so much active actually step up and take up active roles and manage and effectiveness in post operation and maintenance of the systems, which was very meaningful and very encouraging. So this slowly showed us how much women's role is very important, and how much drudgery that they go through, and what they are from after they have this solution. So all this is very important to communicate, and especially the whole main idea was to give inspirations to the other people. And other kind of which when we discussed about audience, we discussed about one is other people getting inspired. Thing is people who are looking for creating change makers, and young people who are doing this work, the NGOs who are doing this work, they can actually specific. I mean, they can go specific into whom they want to train as change makers and everything. And women are one of the most critical and very important group in bringing the change. So this can actually pave a way or bring light on them, so that they are picked and they are trained and on capacities and other ways to empower them, so that they become the agents of change. So that was one thing we touched upon. Also, the local government authorities, especially in these remote areas where things are not like it's not easy to get there, and even for our own systems, we can't get there whenever we want, and that's why we need local capacities built. So in order to, if in all the systems running continue some local capacities, and especially this is not just with water, in any other thing, and local governments have a lot of their schemes and everything going on, their programs and all going on there. So if they pick women as these core agents for their work also, and then they get them trained and everything, they can run the programs, whatever it is, effectively. And by that they are creating employment opportunities for women, which is empowering them, which is bringing them which is bringing them economy to improve their livelihoods and all that. So we discussed about that, and we were very fast in discussing about which platform and what is the communication. We thought about social media, especially, and then also local forms of communication, which can have quick access within these communities and bring light their own small neighborhoods and in local newspapers and all that. So this is what we discussed.
Right, thank you very much. I missed out a little bit where you said you were choosing social media, and then you said something local. Was that local radio stations or local media, or what did you say?
Local newspapers.
Local newspapers as well. Right. Thank you. A lot of good advice also coming from that room. Thank you very much. Room 4, and you have written your responses. So does that mean that you prefer should I read it out, or do you want to read it out, Anne?
No,
From room
I'm happy
4?
to read it out. It was just because I thought maybe we would be running short of time, and so I just typed it down. So basically, we were pretty quick at selecting seeing the unseen, the value of water, sentence 4, I think. We were agreed that it's important to make it visible that running reliable water infrastructure is not free, and water cannot be free. And as our target audience, we went for local government in Johannesburg because one of the ladies in the group said that there was a recent cholera outbreak. So
Yes.
that would be an interesting place to go to. We'd like to make the pollution's negative effect on the local economy visible and encourage action. But then we got stuck in our messaging because actually we don't know what we want the politicians to do because the infrastructure is state-owned. But we say maybe a public affairs effort is needed. And now I'm just elaborating on that because we weren't really sure whether water is big enough to be a game changer in the election. But, perhaps a public affairs campaign could actually make it a topic in the next election. So that's basically what came out of that room.
Thank you very much. And let's hope that water can become a game changer in the next elections, which is, by the way, in South Africa next year. So let's work on that. Thank you very much, room 4. Yes, we are running a little bit out of time, but as we have no speaker after this session, I'm just thinking that it's nice to have the discussion. And we are now calling on room 6. We have Marissa, Michael, and Michael. I'm not sure if I pronounce it or Michael's correctly, and Valerie. Anyone volunteering to talk about your findings in room 6?
Yes, I did the exercise in writing with the people who were in the room, and we started with the premise that not demanding good quality information about water leads you to our vulnerability, and we all thought that this could apply to anywhere could be, but one of the guys brought this specific example, the community of Bololo. I think it was Zimbabwe or something like that. So we thought that if we had the audience, and yes, we said the audience could be the rural community of Bololo, and the story could be how the community got involved in the operation of facilities to ensure their right to water. Why is it important? And they said, and we say that to get the water project stays for long, the appropriation, because we all know that this is a common problem in this context. And then we thought who could be the audience. And we know that there are different audiences here. We sort of thought on different audiences, but we say that the priority was the village development group, like a sort of a committee there. And the way to reach out was like direct in the first contact, but then we thought that we could have facilitation groups, because here we are talking about direct communication, and regardless of the materials that we could develop later, that could be the first approach. And then, of course, yes, the platform could be should be training in person, because sometimes in this context we do not have the technology, so we could do this in person. And finally, well, I just add something like the Bololo like transforming a little bit this first premise. It could be something like the Bololo Village committee is using good quality information about water or how this leads to operate water facilities for life. So that will be it.
Thank you. Very nice. And I like the way also that we have different ways of communicating, from social media and local newspapers to training in person. Because I mean, it is important when we talk about communications, how do we best reach our audience? So we must think of different ways. And that's that you like said here now, training in person would be the better way to reach this audience here. Thank you so much for participating. Marissa, you've also posted a kind reminder for the group on LinkedIn for everyone who would like to keep conversing about water and communication. There is a LinkedIn group there, a communications group where we can all keep up the conversation. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Thanks to the Grundfos Foundation, and thanks to Cecile, our producer.